Okay, I'm going to get started if that's okay, Connie.
That's fine, thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to the Association of Public Data Users' second webinar of the year. And today we are delighted to have with us Connie Citro discussing her take on the 2020 census and also looking forward to the 2030. I think that Connie needs no introduction, but I'm gonna give one anyways in case anybody doesn't know who we are thrilled to have join us today. Connie is a senior scholar with CNSTAT. That's the Committee on National Statistics. She previously served as their director from 2004 to 2017 and a senior program officer there from 1984 to 2004. Prior to joining CNSTAT, she was vice president of Mathematica Policy Research and Dual Use and Access, Data Use and Access Laboratories, and also was a social science analyst with the Census Bureau. Connie is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and an elected member of the International Statistical Institute. Her degrees are in political science with a BA from the University of Rochester and her master's and PhD from Yale University. For CNSTAT, she has numerous studies of the census, the ACS, the SIP, a study leading to the supplemental poverty measure, and multiple updates of the P&P books, Principles and Practices for a Federal Statistical Agency. So as I said, at APDU, we are delighted to have Connie join us today. She is going to be walking through some slides, giving us an overview of this report. And if you have any questions, please use the raise hand function and we'll make sure that we catch those. And we also are going to have some time toward the end of the webinar for Q&A. So Connie, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so very, very much. I'm just actually thrilled to be doing this. I've been an APDU member for many years, and it is a great organization. And so again, I'm just thrilled to be here to talk about a hefty and I think important report on assessing the 2020 census, our final report that was released last October. And I believe Beth put the link in the chat. Again, you can get a free PDF downloaded or you can read online at your heart's content. Okay, what were we asked to do? This report was funded by the US Census Bureau. Essentially, we were asked to look at everything we could to make an assessment of the quality of the data collected in the 2020 census and to make recommendations about further research that census should do to evaluate the quality and to begin planning for 2030. So before I get into what we did, here are the folks who did it. Our chair was Terry Sullivan, who's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. She was its president. She is very familiar with census data, and she was just a great chair. You can see some of the other names there. Our own Joe Salvo, who's been an APDU stalwart for many years, and many other very distinguished folks. And then at the bottom right are the staff. Dan Cork was the study director, and the rest of us did a lot of work. There are some names that have stars by them. Those were people who actually went above and beyond to do analytic work on confidential data behind the, quote, firewall at the Census Bureau. So, like other consensus studies at the Academy, where we have a group of experts, we had public open meetings, and Census Bureau gave us very informative soup to nuts presentations about every aspect of the 2020 census. And then we were all cleared, sworn in to discuss confidential data in closed meetings. Our subgroup, our analytic subgroup, was cleared at a higher level. And we spent a long time meeting 2 or 3 times a week and then doing our own work, where The login requirements to get behind the census firewall, as some of you may know, are really quite something. And they use Microsoft Teams, which behind their firewall, anyway, it was quite an adventure. But we did look and work with confidential data. But the only figures and tables that are in this report that anybody will see from our work are those that were cleared, reviewed by their disclosure review board, and they were either had some rounding or some modest noise infusion, and those were ported from behind the firewall to be in the report. And just to fulfill the legal niceties here, these are the disclosure review board numbers that accompany any such analyses. I will say from the get-go, we did not plan to do any looking at individual data. We looked at indicators, process indicators, and we did not intend to look at, did state X really deserve to lose a seat or gain a seat or anything like that. We were operating generally at a fairly high level of aggregation, but sufficient enough to enable us to make our assessments. Okay, our main messages. Well, think back to 2020. We may have all mercifully, closed off our memories of what a nightmare that year was. But for the census, again, the nation shut down just as the Census Bureau was gearing up to do various field work and so on, and things had to be put on hold. So our overriding conclusion is the nation is in great debt to the Census Bureau staff for completing the census under exceptionally difficult circumstances. The COVID, there were hurricanes, wildfires, there were attempts to politically interfere with the census. It was really, really tough. One thing that really helped, and I will give the CNSTAT a little credit here because we worked with the Census Bureau leading up to the 2020 census in 4 innovation areas that they did a lot of testing and planning and so on, and that really served them in good stead. One, of course, was implementing the internet self-response and positioning as the major response channel. So when COVID hit, they could keep that response option open and so on and so on. They also shifted some of the pre-census expensive address canvassing field work to in-office review, things like Google Street View, et cetera. They re-engineered their field management and case handling systems so that they were highly automated. Interviewers would get downloads on their phones for what their assignment was. They didn't actually have to go to the coffee shop or McDonald's to meet with their crew leader as they did in previous censuses. And they permitted selective use of administrative records to enumerate some non-responding households where they, quote, had reliable records and they considered the previous census and the ACS as administrative records for this purpose, plus other records, and where they had made at least one field visit and hadn't found anybody. They also did some other things that helped them. They were able to modify on the fly their mailing and contact strategy, which had been pretty well worked out to begin with, to give people more time, to give them more replacement questionnaires, more nudges for the internet, et cetera. They had originally been going to do update enumerate for both the very remote areas, traditionally done that way, and for update leave areas. They fortunately reinstated update leave because there the census folks just leave a questionnaire on the doorknob and then you fill it out and you could have gone to the internet or you send the paper back in, and that reduced the contacts during COVID. And they had given attention to the master address file coverage and updating. So they were about as well positioned as you could be, but the circumstances, again, were very, very, very tough. And again, they deserve a lot of credit. That said, no census is or can be perfect. And 2020 had its share of data quality issues. It was not as good a quality census as 2010 in a number of dimensions, again, exacerbated by COVID, by, I think, anti-immigrant attitudes of the previous administration, et cetera. You'll see that in some of what I'm going to show you. There's a phenomenon called age heaping. It occurs to at least some extent in virtually every census and survey around the world that asks about age. It's when people will round off an age, and they tend to round it off at 0 and 10. So let's say, oh, say you're a neighbor responding for somebody. I think he's about 50. And I think she's 45, and the kids are 10 and 15. You know, they'll do stuff like that. And in the census, they ask you both date of birth and age. And the reason for asking date of birth is so they can get a good cross check on this sort of and not have age heaping. But there are folks that do not provide the date of birth and that age heap. And in these graphs and others that follow, green is 2020 and blue is 2010. So for the total population on the left, you see these little squiggles here, and this is age heaping at ages that end in 0 and 5, using a metric that one of our very statistically expert panel members actually developed. And you can see the blue squiggles are fairly low, and the range here is just from -1 to 2 for this metric. The green squiggles are higher, and it's particularly in working ages. What happened is that proxy responses were truly bad in 2020. They're not great anyway. That's the neighbor, the landlord. There weren't necessarily more proxy respondents in 2020 than 2010, but the quality of the data was bad. So they did not give date of birth, so you couldn't cross-check. And here are the proxy respondents. Here, the scale goes from -10 to +25 of this metric, and the spikes there for 2020 in particular are very high. There's not much age heaping going on for kids, which is good because lots of people use these data for school projections, and age heaping would totally mess that up. But there is a lot here, again, particularly for working age. The other thing about age heaping is it's traditionally been viewed as a canary in the coal mine indicator that if you've got this going on, you've probably got other problems. Okay, group quarters. Group quarters, ever since I have been following the census, which is a long time, many censuses, it tends to bring up the rear. And it is, of course, group quarters are fewer than 3% of the population in the 2020 census, but locally, the prison, the nursing home, the college dorm looms large in local communities. So COVID hit just at the wrong time. Census was going to do an early NRFU with college students, but they had all been sent home. Nursing, healthcare facilities, prisons, you couldn't get in the door. Now, they endeavored to convert a lot of GQs to e-response, where people at the facility would send in their responses. But there's something called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, that restricts what colleges and universities can give out. And a lot of them interpret that as just directory information, meaning name and address. So you can see that in the imputation rates. Again, blue is 2010, green is 2020. Ethnicity and race are not great, weren't great in 2010, but ethnicity is really terribly high. These are imputation rates after they've done their best to edit and figure out an answer. You know, up to 45% almost of ethnicity is imputed in the 2020 GQ. Even sex and age of date of birth is not great for GQ. So the GQ data, again, nationally, doesn't make, even for many states as an aggregate, doesn't make a lot of difference, but locally it can make a very large difference. So that is really unfortunate, although the Census Bureau even put in extra effort after the close of the field work to try to recontact group quarters and so on. Okay, differential undercount. If the US Census had just an undercount, there are people missed and then there'll be duplicates and things, but the balance is the net undercount. If that was only 2, 3, even 5% across the board, geographically and population group wise, it would not really matter. It's the difference in net undercount rates between geographies and population groups that means that anything like representatives in Congress or state legislatures or fund allocation, anything that's being allocated out of a fixed pie, when you've got differential undercount, you've got some areas that are getting less than their fair share and others that are getting more. Well, this is from the post-enumeration survey, which is one of the two methods of evaluating undercount. The other is demographic analysis. The demographic analysis is a more high quality analysis, but it's very limited. It's national, there's no sub-state, and there is very limited race detail, and what they should provide is actually not even yet available. The PES had problems in 2020, but they managed to complete it. They did extra field work, etc. And again, these are major race and ethnicity groups. And what happened in 2020, and we're not actually sure of all the reasons, but net overcount increased for white non-Hispanics and went from virtually neither over or under for Asian Americans, increase there. And American Indians on reservations have always been poorly counted. It got worse in 2020. Same thing for Black people. Hispanic net undercount went way up. And so there's a bigger differential just in 2020. Okay, again, the net undercount is made up of the offset of people who should not be in the census, like they were counted twice, like maybe the college student at home and in college, or the snowbird and so on, and people who were just plain missed. They take a sample of blocks, they do an independent survey, that's the P sample, they match it with the people who actually showed up in the census enumeration called the E sample, and they see who matches and who's not there, and they do some field work to verify that they've got the best estimate possible of who matches and who's missing. And so P sample omissions for 2020, actually, it was a little better for white, non-Hispanic, and Asian Americans. A little worse for Black people, equally bad for American Indian, Alaska Natives on reservations, and higher for Hispanics. There were more Hispanic people missed, is what's estimated in 2020. Now, this is some data that Census Bureau had not originally published, but they'd actually created for 2010 and then for 2020. And when we got interested in it behind the firewall, they decided this data is actually publicly out there. And this is taking owner-renter with some age and sex groupings, and for the major race ethnic groups. They've also got the data for NHOPE and smaller groups, which we did not publish because the standard errors, the sampling error is pretty large. But again, green is 2020, blue is 2010. This is the Black percent net undercount. And essentially, there are groups that are, there's some that are overcounted. Older women tend to be overcounted across the board. But particularly notice on the right side of the graph, the renter undercount. And that was generally high in both censuses and higher in 2020. You can also see the little kids, even on the left side of the graph for owners, little kids ages 0 to 4 were not well counted. And this problem of counting little kids has come up over and over again. Here's the same kind of graph for Hispanic population. And what's really remarkable here, look at the renter side. Those green bars are above the blue bars in every instance. The undercount for Hispanic kids, the undercount almost all the way through the age distribution is much worse than in 2010. And I should say the little tiny bars that are along the horizontal axis there are where they're not statistically significantly different from 0. So the ones that are really there are ones that that are statistically significant. So again, I think you can chalk this up to Hispanic people's worries about the government, et cetera, and probably some other factors too. But particularly renter housing is where lots of these problems occur. And for Asians, which I don't show, there's big overcounts in renter housing in 2020. So, and I'm not sure quite why that would be. Okay, turning to another quality indicator, which is, okay, you've got the people in the census, but they're missing one or more. They have enough data there to be what census calls data defined. Anyway, so this is item imputation rates by type of response. If you get a self-response, and that could mean internet, paper, telephone, you get good quality data. You get very low missing data rates. If you get a response from a household member, particularly the household reference person in NRFU, you get pretty decent data. Proxy data is not good, and administrative records was good for age and date of birth, not quite so good for ethnicity and race. So interesting there in terms of those mode effects. Some other findings, which will not be surprising, but we should remind ourselves of them. Households in the poorest census tracts were least likely, and households in census tracts with the largest size housing units were most likely to self-respond, where clearly the housing unit size is an indicator of better offness. Similarly, households in the poorest tracts were least likely, and households in the tracts with most prevalent broadband and highest median incomes were most likely to self-respond by the internet. And I think in this census, there were two kinds of internet problems. One in rural areas where you just didn't have the broadband to begin with, and one in, say, city disadvantaged areas where you've got a phone, but you undoubtedly can't afford, and maybe they haven't built out the latest, fiber optics to your area, where effectively you're in an internet desert there too. Okay, households in census tracts with the most owner units were least likely, and households in the tracts with the most renter units were most likely to have these proxy enumerations, which particularly in 2020 were not great enumerations. Then by the race and ethnic groups, internet self-responders, most prevalent among Asian households, 2 or more, white alone, some other race, Hispanic, Black alone, and Hopi, American Indian, Native, Alaskan, where they just, they don't have broadband on the reservations. This last point on race, if you remember, the idea was to try to combine the questions for 2020, but OMB did not allow that. So there were still the race ethnicity questions, but census added write-in spaces for white and Black, which had not been there before. They'd always been there for the other categories. And if you were on the internet, and I know this from personal experience, you were just having a lot of fun figuring out what you were going to write in those write-in responses. And they also captured more of what people wrote in than they had before. So you got lots of write-ins from internet responses relative to paper or NERFU responses. Given that there are these differences of propensity to use the internet among race and ethnic groups, this means that there's quite a bit of confounding going on in terms of the race distributions that were produced. And there's certainly more work. We did a little bit that we could in our report, much more work that could be done to get behind the big changes that came out of 2020, which were a big decline in the white non-Hispanic alone and a big increase in two or more races, particularly for Hispanic groups. Okay, that is the, oh, no, sorry, can't not talk about this. Disclosure avoidance. We essentially said this was a misguided decision to, at the 11th hour, respond to the threats to confidentiality protection, which are very real, but at a late date in census planning with a new complex algorithm, the differential privacy, you just don't do this kind of a major change in a census. You do a lot more research and testing before you do something as big a change as this was. The approach hadn't been tested in a census environment, didn't know whether it would actually handle critical user needs, and there was no backup plan should they run into problems. So, ran into problems. The Census Bureau decided to keep going. So we still do not have all the data products out. Some variables and types of geographic units are of questionable utility, and others have not been provided at all. And tools to help users understand and analyze these data that have noise infused everywhere are lacking at the moment. I do understand, I heard recently that Census is going to announce at the Population Association that they're very close to having a technique for generating kind of confidence intervals, and that will be great. I also heard that they will be releasing what used to be called the planning database. I'm not sure what the name is now, but essentially it's census tract information from the ACS, and they're usually things like response rates from the previous census and other process indicators. And I have heard that they're planning to do that without doing much noise, which is great. The only small area process metrics that Census has released to date for census tracts are so noised up that they are essentially not usable. Finally, with this new approach, it's not clear that the chosen privacy budgets actually give all that much privacy protection. Not clear. Now, we did not assess differential privacy. We were not constituted to do that. It has desirable theoretical properties, and it is useful for some types of applications, and I know about some of them, and I'm all for them. And confidentiality protection is pretty darn important. It's the decision to implement in 2020 without the prototype and testing and adequate engagement of the user community. You just don't do this for a census. And if Census felt they had to do more, there are other things that they could have done. Similarly, we say in our report that expecting to do the next census with heavy use of administrative records, there's talk about in some other countries too, like Canada, it would be 2/3 administrative record census. This is not feasible for 2030. There are too many issues to work out, from the quality of the records to how you sell it to the public, because you're going to use records here but not there, and so on. So for a census, you do testing and stakeholder engagement and it may seem like it can take a long time, but when they introduced the mail out census in the first place, that was based on several decades of research and testing. Okay, so for 2030, and I'm close to the end of my formal slides here. Like our predecessor panel, we recommend the Census Bureau focus primary attention, pick out your major innovation areas. One is maximizing self-response to the census. Hopefully broadband build out in areas will help that. You've got to do something not to have this proxy problem in NRFU. Nationally, it was tolerable, but for small areas where proxies cluster, like for instance in census tracts with rental housing, and that's just got to be addressed. And of course, it's easy for me and the Academy panel sit there and say, you got to address this, but that is a priority. Similarly, the gaps in coverage and data quality associated with race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Got to do, which I understand they are planning to work on, the group quarters, addressing, and contact stuff, at least for the big group quarter types, prisons, nursing homes, college dorms, that be priority, just like the MAF updating is much earlier in the decennial planning cycle than it has been in the past. And finally, realigning the balance between utility, timeliness, and confidentiality protection. And in that regard, the Census Bureau can't lobby for laws and so on, but they can be open, for instance, to legislation that, for instance, would put penalties on data users for deliberate misuse of data, similar to the penalties that are already on the Census Bureau and other statistical agency staff, so that one could build a shared culture of confidentiality protection and appropriate data use, and not have the Census Bureau and other statistical agencies think they have to start putting more and more stuff off limits or in some very difficult to access enclave or something like that. They have to do that with some data sets, but I think some of them have been moving too far in that direction. Now, APTU. Now, each of you is going to have your own interests in particular aspects of the census, such as group quarters or the master address file or undercount for particular groups. I hope that collectively, I use lobby just because it's shorthand, but that you will work for, encourage genuine interactive dialogue with Census Bureau staff in charge of 2030 data products. My suggested strategy is as follows. We are not the experts on technical methods of privacy protection, but we are the experts on what we need. And we need timely data. This is the first census in which it has taken so long to get data out the door. Even allowing for some of the delay initially due to COVID, most of the delay was due to the differential privacy needing to refine the algorithm and kick the tires and so on. So we need the timely data that we've had in the past. We need the data to be usable. We need join variables, which are things like household size, which requires relating, how many people you've got in the housing unit. And there are many other household variables with their person characteristics that are really important for research, for state and local and federal planning. And the DP algorithm that was used for the the redistricting file and the DHC file couldn't do that. They managed to get some of those join variables on the DHC by doing some recodes of creating those variables, and then DP could process that, but it couldn't actually do them. Okay, we definitely need to meet the Census Bureau, part way on confidentiality concerns. I see two important ways this could be done for 2030 for the census. First of all, the redistricting file, as you may know, has, people reported one race and two races, all the possible combinations. And if they said 5 races, there are all the possible combinations. In fact, people who reported 4 and 5 races, and I looked this up, and also that's 6 or more, there's only a couple 100,000 of them in the whole country. And I've heard redistrictors say they don't need that. What they do need is some things that are not in the PL file, but have to be fairly laboriously constructive, like the entire Black population alone and in combination. You have to go through all these permutations and add that up. So I really hope the Census Bureau will work starting now with the redistricting community and other users to say, can we streamline, particularly if there's a combined question and there's a MENA and a Hispanic, all in one question, that they've got to streamline. And the more they streamline to what makes sense, then the more protected the data are already. And the hand of differential privacy or whatever they use doesn't have to be so heavy. Similarly, the median block in the census had 28 people in 2020. The one that's talked about all the time is the Statue of Liberty. There's a caretaker couple or something, and the Census Bureau altered their age and race, I believe. What they should do is put that block with some other block in New York City. It should not be sitting out there. So if they worked with localities to give blocks a more reasonable sort of minimum population size, again, that would help privacy all by itself. So they could then use whatever technical method they think they should use, but it would have much less deleterious effect than it did in 2020. Okay, my bottom line, we need working groups, whether that's one, but APTU, whether APTU has its own or gets with other folks, where the Census Bureau is actually dialoguing, here's some alternatives. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And they need then a product operational plan by 27. We say this in the report, and tested in 2028 to have useful, timely data from the 2030 census. And with that, I thank you very, very much. And I think I had a last slide there somewhere. It doesn't seem to want to come up, but which just had my name on it. So there you go. Thank you.
Connie, there
we are.
Fantastic.
And there's my email. If you have any questions that you wish to send to me directly, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Wonderful. There was one in the chat from Dan B. I'll read it, but if he wants to unmute and speak over me, that's
sure. Shall I stop sharing and then I can see more faces? Or
sure.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you all.
All right, not hearing them. The comment is, the umbrella of administrative data makes sense when it's tax data or unemployment insurance data. Widening the umbrella to include the ACS seems problematic. Isn't ACS supposed to benchmark to enumeration or incorporate enumeration data eventually? I've also heard it called a test bed for the census. In the chat there, Connie, I mentioned that the mandatory data collections, like the previous censuses and the ACS, were used to impute demographic characteristics like race and ethnicity where it was self-reported or family proxy reported. What is your take on the use of ACS?
Well, again, this was in the context of a very limited use of administrative records in 2020. The idea, as I understood it, you went out in NRFU, you don't find a lot of households, you don't find anybody the first time. You have meanwhile back at the ranch had your model and your records set up, and you determine that there is a subset of those folks for whom you think you have good data. And when I say the previous census or the ACS, yes, those data are, remember, all you're trying to get here is the head count and some basic demographics. You're not trying to get income or housing type or anything like that. So the idea was that if they had at this address, they had had, say, a recent ACS enumeration, um, and I'm not sure again what their model had in it, but they have reason to believe that this is a neighborhood where the housing stock is pretty stable, et cetera, then they might use that enumeration to give these basic sets of data. I think it was about now, the other thing they did with administrative data was to determine that, okay, they didn't find anybody at the house because, in fact, it was vacant or it was torn down or it was now a daycare center or something like that. So, and that was a very helpful use. I think of the enumerated population, about 4%, 4% came from administrative records, but a lot more of NRFU, and again, these vacant and delete units as they call them. But again, the key is they're using any of these records for just the very few data items that they collect in the census.
Thanks. Terry Ann?
Yeah, hi, and thanks so much
Hi.
for doing this webinar. Thanks so much for the summary, Connie. A quick question. You, I think, correctly pointed out, or you correctly concluded that such a high use of proxy data, especially during NRFU, is really problematic given the quality, and that's been the case for decades. So and I think your slide said something to the fact is if there are other better sources available. So can you just expand on that a little? What sources do you think might be better? And put aside ad recs on the vacant, delete and stuff, but in terms of actually enumerating occupied houses during
Yeah, that is really tough. One thing that I think the Census Bureau should do is we did have, because you've seen some of that in my slides, census tract. We took characteristics from the ACS and we looked at one off, but what census needs to do is, and perhaps swear in a whole bunch of local people and university researchers and so on, is look at those tracts where all of this piled up of renter, low income, low internet, low everything. And for one thing, there are and see if, for instance, there are administrative records like SNAP records. The Census Bureau does not have them for all states because each state owns those records. But there are records like that that perhaps could be used, and also other local data sources, but try to identify, again, of course, areas change, but there are areas, in rural areas, they need to keep tabs on how the internet broadband build out is actually happening. And in cities, look at those areas that, as you say, historically, but had even worse problems in 2020, and come up with almost kind of a tailored solution if they can. I think that's probably the only way to do that. And one other comment on that, the internet was great for this census. I mean, lifesaver, et cetera, but it exacerbated, like in Washington, D.C., there were census tracts in the well-off Northwest area, which had almost, 98% response and the internet. And then areas in far southeast and northeast DC, disadvantaged areas where it was all NRFU and proxy, and it was just, but I think it's kind of a labor intensive thing. We do have some technical research recommendations in appendices for how you might start to do some of that, to kind of throw every record, every ACS census, everything together to try to identify tracts and clusters of tracts where you're going to have to think outside the box, and outside just trying to put more feet on the ground, but and think outside the box in other ways.
Okay.
I
Amy, can
wish I
I
didn't.
just do a really, really quick follow-up? I
Sure.
know somebody else has a hand up. So did the panel think that therefore in some targeted areas, and this is of great interest to, many advocates on the ground,
Mhm.
that there ought to be more door knocks? So don't cut off the door knocks at 3 or 4, or I know it was a few more. Is
Yeah.
that an option or not really?
We didn't get into that.
Okay.
Again, they would have to do, which they could do, and they could, swear in folks to help them with this, which I think would be a great idea to do, where you could, because there's variation out there, and you could match up tracks that are otherwise similar in some characteristics, but where for some reason the door knocking was more effective. And you could try to simulate, what might happen if there were more door knocks. But this requires, again, the Census Bureau's own research tends not to be at this micro level, but I think that is what is needed. If I were they, I would recruit a group of folks who are researchers who are interested in this, and get them sworn in and let them really look at the details of the data and do some of this kind of analysis to try to get an evidence base. Every census I've been in or I've observed, the Census Bureau always sets up a working group internally on undercount, but I have not seen a great deal of evidence-based work that could support, okay, it really looks promising to try X in this city, or X plus Y in that city. And again, I think that requires a really deep dive into the data.
Francisco?
Hey, hello. Well, this is a great presentation. As you all know, there were 6 states undercounted, 8 states overcounted, and the PES in 2012, when released in 2022, was not providing undercounting numbers for sub-state levels.
Right.
So we at the Texas Census Institute, we are concerned about this because we are doing our best in developing research, trying to educate stakeholders and policymakers to have a better 2030 census. And of course, all of the efforts surrounding this, which is LUCA and all of the potential activities before the census. So my question is, if any of you know about any way or any other state's efforts in estimating the undercount at the county level. We are developing our approaches, but I would like to know from a panel of experts like you all are, if somebody else is doing something.
First of all, the PES in 2020 had sufficient problems that it is not reliable in itself to try to develop more estimates than they actually published. We did not look into what other states or communities might be doing. So I really can't answer the question, but I imagine that states with some, local state data and other things could work with the PES estimates to say, okay, it's not just that Hispanics say we're net undercounted, but it's Hispanics in these kinds of likely in these kinds of areas based on everything we know. Well, again, that would be great if you could get a hold of some of these process indicators like proxy responses at a local level. So I hope Census really follows through. Again, what they released is not usable for that purpose because they put too much noise into it. But I'll be really interested to see what you all come up with.
Thanks. Deb had a question in the chat. Deb, do you want to say it or you want me to read it?
Happy to say it.
Thank you.
I mean, there's enormous amount of food for thought here, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's gonna go back and try and write up the key points from the perspective, in my case, of the undercount of young kids. I was really struck by the renter data compared to the owner data.
Yes.
I wondered if there was any way to break that data out by people living in multi-unit buildings compared to single unit buildings. And the reason I'm asking is that the Bureau was really appallingly bad in 2020 about letting owners and managers of multi-unit buildings know that they were supposed to let enumerators in.
Yeah.
And we've called them out on this consistently, and we keep pushing it. But it would be really, there's an assumption that renters are more likely to be in multi-unit buildings than owners. But of course, you're talking about DC data, and in DC, both
Yeah.
areas.
Because
Right. So I'm wondering if there was any way to try and break down single unit dwellings compared to multi-unit.
not not from the PES itself, but again, if the planning database were to have housing data like that, and if it were to have response rates, but even better, non-response broken down by household reference person, and actually, if you get another member of the household, the teenager or the somebody else, that's not great data either. But and you look for the proxy, and if they would put proxy rates on there, you could then do some mapping and analysis that would say, yeah, this was a this area, it looks like, yeah, a lot of multi-unit buildings, and that was the problem. So it's getting those process indicators out for small areas would be the most helpful thing, actually, for all these kinds of analyses to take place, and including for advocacy groups, local governments and state governments, to be able to say to the Census Bureau, we're pretty sure this area is going to be tough, and how about we work on, what could help to, whether that be letting people in the building in some areas, or some other strategy.
Thanks, Connie. So at previous webinars and town halls, people may have heard me say that the way that DP was rolled out, it seemed like the user community was doing quality control for the Census Bureau.
Yeah.
How do we avoid that moving forward? And how come you guys released this report? Does Census need to farm all of that out? How do we get more information?
That is a good question. And I think I understand that the Census Bureau the folks who are there right now realize that this was not the greatest process in 2020, and they want to do better. So that's good. What I worry about is they may not want to do better fast enough to things like the redistricting file have to be worked out pretty soon, because the redistricting community, they need to write their software, and they don't want to have to wait to the 11th hour. And they have the use case that's in legislation and the Constitution practically. And, so, but again, I have heard directly from some redistrictors that the current structure of the redistricting file both is not helpful in that they have to do a lot of work to add up things that they want, and gives them this additional detail that they don't ever use. But I'm not sure. There are folks who at least connected with APTU or know about APTU who are on like some of their advisory committees. There is supposed to be this summer, I guess, they might finally name their 2030 advisory committee. But what they really need to have, in my view, it could be a subset of that 2030 committee, is a working group of data users who are intermediaries between all of you here and the Census Bureau, and who get ideas and put some stakes in the ground. One that we put in the report was that every governmental jurisdiction, no matter how small, should have the counted population. Personally, I'd round it off a little bit, maybe if they want to do that, but not putting local governments who need official numbers. They may know their population just fine, but they need an official number to go for a state grant or a federal grant or whatever. And they should not be having to wonder whether this funny number they got was real or was because they were unlucky in the DP distribution draw. So we actually have that in the report.
That's great. Well, Connie, I want to thank you. And as you mentioned this summer, I want to invite everyone here to save the date for the AppDo conference that's coming up in July. Maybe we can begin some of those important conversations that Connie just alluded to. It's going to be held at Georgetown's Capitol campus. So not over by Foggy Bottom, but over by Union Station. So keep an eye on our newsletter and communications. And also, we are going to be having another webinar next month that I hope that you join us for. That's going to be some folks from the National Center for State Courts sharing information about the important data that they have and the video series that they also produce. But everyone, if you can join me in thanking Connie for this information, we are going to be sharing out the link to this video and also her slides. And she had her email there at the end of it. So if you have additional questions.
Absolutely. So please don't hesitate to email. I'm a real census groupie, and I'm happy to talk to Annie and all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.